As most of you are aware, the National Cathedral had an invitation to Muslims to conduct prayers last Friday, and I wanted to invite Jeff Walton from the IRD onto the program and do a quick interview with Anglican TV about what occurred, kind of the ramifications, and to put into perspective exactly what the National Cathedral is. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Okay, people have seen you on here before. You work for the IRD. What is the IRD again?
We're an ecumenical alliance of U.S. Christians working to call our churches back to what we call historical and biblical Christian teachings. Mm-hmm. So the short message is we're people in mainline Protestant denominations that have a conservative theology.
Okay. So you had the opportunity Friday, like so many of us didn't, to sit in front of a webcast from the National Cathedral and watch the service. Now, before we talk about the actual service, let's talk about what the National Cathedral is. As people are aware, in our Constitution, we have a separation of church and state. The state cannot specifically support one religion. So when you hear the National Cathedral, it is not something that the U.S. government is endorsing as a religion. But money comes from outside sources to help fund it. Many of the big services you've seen where a president is buried or other types of events happen at the National Cathedral. A beginning prayer for a presidency, inaugural prayer will happen there. It's used, but it's not endorsed. So why is this a big deal? Well, it's a big deal to some people because they find that we're using a cathedral for Muslim prayers. Let's talk about how the church came about. Jeff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the National Cathedral began construction in the early 1900s. A lot of the money that came for the building of the cathedral was fundraised from outside of the Episcopal Church. And it took about 90 years to complete the building. The main towers were not completed until, I think, 1992. So this was a work in progress for many, many years. The joke kind of is it's an Episcopal church that is intended for a house of prayer for all peoples and is built with other people's money. So there was a lot of fundraising that took place. I do believe there was a congressional action which sort of chartered a lot of this. But officially, it's an Episcopal Church cathedral, and obviously the Episcopal Church is not an established church like there are in some countries. So it doesn't have an official status in the sense of being an official state church or anything like that.
Well, as you and I both know, it was an Episcopal church. It has an Episcopal vestry. It's run by, it's not owned by the Episcopal Church, but there's a National Cathedral Foundation that runs this as well. However, it is the seat of power for the Episcopal Bishop of Washington and kind of unofficially a seat of power for the presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Schori. So when I heard that there was going to be Muslim prayers on Friday, I'm like, is this going to be a competition for the best pagan prayer? Is this something new that the Church is doing with the National Cathedral? And I didn't have time to watch. Let's talk about what occurred right before the event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 5 different Muslim groups who were invited by the cathedral to help host this event identified an area that was in the north transept of the cathedral. Now, this is part of the sanctuary, so it is in the main church, but they make a distinction and say it's not part of the nave, which is the central corridor of the cathedral. So they consider it kind of equivalent to a side chapel or a side space.
A parish hall.
But they put out prayer rugs. I'm sorry, say again?
A parish hall?
No, it's not a parish hall. It's part of the sanctuary. Okay. I mean, it's open to the main nave. So it is part of the main cathedral space. It's not a separate room. But they put out prayer rugs, went ahead and cleared out the chairs, and they decided to use this space because it was oriented towards Mecca, and also, as I said, there was, quote, limited iconography there. So, for example, there weren't any prominent crosses or religious imagery that's from outside of Islam that would need to be covered or obscured in order for them to have prayer there. But yeah, so this was an invitation-only event. So it was not a huge number of worshipers, but they came in, and then there was a cordoned off area that was prepared for media, mostly photographers that wished to take photos. The local NBC affiliate was there, the Washington Post, Religion News Service had someone. And they were able to go and observe these prayers. Additionally, there were welcoming comments that were given by the cathedral staff, both the cathedral's canon for liturgy and Dean Gary Hall, who has been the leader of the National Cathedral for the past, I believe, 2.5 years. In addition to that, there were a variety of people who had kind of milled around beforehand in the cathedral. As I said, it was technically closed to the public until tours started later that afternoon, but some people had been in there anyway. And apparently that's how a woman who was a protester got in. And during the initial welcoming comments, she got up and pointed at the cross and said, that cross is why we're here, because Jesus Christ died for us, and that's why we are to worship him alone. And then she said, our country has freedom of religion, and there are mosques that are available throughout our country. Why is it that you cannot worship in those mosques, but you have to come here to our churches, leave our churches alone? At that point, she was escorted out without incident. She's since been identified as Christine Week, a 50-year-old woman from Michigan. Apparently, she was in Tennessee when she found out about the cathedral service in advance on the Drudge Report, of all things, and she drove here hoping to be able to say something about it. So that was kind of an interesting stir at the beginning of the event.
Wow. So now the event has occurred. We've had a Muslim prayer, Muslim service on the grounds of the National Cathedral. Well, what's the big deal? Is the question at the end of the day. Clearly, after the earthquake a couple years ago, we've seen God's judgment on the National Cathedral. This can't be surprising that it's gone downhill since then. It's not a functioning church to the point where they can take in enough money in the plates to pay all the expenses. It is kind of a museum of church.
Yeah, and indeed, they actually are charging admission now. As of this year, the National Cathedral charges a $10 admission if someone wishes to tour the building outside of a worship service time.
Why should the average Christian care that we're having Muslim prayers now in the National Cathedral?
Well, I think there's two things that are a concern. The first is theological. The cathedral's sanctuary, of which the North Transept is a part of, is a space that is consecrated to the worship of Jesus Christ. So the fact that they are bringing in non-Christian worship to be led in that space is problematic. Now, Kevin, you already know the history of the cathedral. You know that this is hardly the first non-Christian worship to take place in that space. But for most people, this is the first time they've ever heard of this. Most people aren't familiar with the Native American smudging ceremonies, offering gifts of smoking tobacco to the spirits of the four cardinal directions that took place in 2008, or some of the Tibetan monks that came in and did sand painting prayers on the cathedral nave floor. So there's a long history of this stuff. It's been going on for at least 35 years, when I can tell. However, that theological concern is still legitimate. And the second concern is one of prudence in regards to who has been invited into the cathedral. Of the 5 Muslim organizations that have sponsored this prayer service, several of them are linked historically to the Muslim Brotherhood. As widely known, the Council on American Islamic Relations was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, which involved the channeling of money charitably from the United States to terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Additionally, the Islamic Society of North America and the Muslim Public Affairs Council also have those historic ties. So there's an issue of, are these the right people to be inviting into this space? Is there a problem with having them there? There was an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Security Policy, which prior to this event authored a letter to Dean Hall and copied it to Bishop Booty, expressing their concerns. It was a well-written letter. It said, we understand you might have a lot of skepticism about our claims, so we would welcome the opportunity to sit down with you and explain some of our concerns. These were not theological concerns. They were historical and political concerns. And a number of people have signed on to that letter, including about 5 bishops from the Anglican Church in North America, among others. And my colleague Faith McDonald was also a co-signer. So there are those two different concerns about what happened, the theological concerns and then the issues of political prudence of inviting in these specific organizations.
So you still haven't answered the question as to, it's just a building. It's, you know, it's sure it's a, but you know, it's an Episcopal building. Why should we care? And yeah, it's, these guys supported terrorism, but isn't that more of a question for the government, not a question for the church?
Well, there's issues of prudence of who we choose to invite into our spaces and why we choose to do that. We can set ourselves up for problems down the road if we don't have a critical eye towards what other people are saying and doing that we invite into our church buildings to lead services. And that's the big distinction here. It would be one thing to have an interfaith service or interfaith dialogue hosted at the cathedral in which you give people the venue to speak. But this is unique from that. This is Muslim groups being invited in to lead a service at the cathedral. So I think there's a different level of endorsement taking place here. And that's the distinction I would make of why people should care. Now, again, those people who are familiar with the history of the National Cathedral know that it is not a beacon of Christian orthodoxy. The dean of the cathedral is functionally universalist, and he has boldly proclaimed that since at least 2012. So this is not really a surprise in that department. But for most people, they're learning about this for the first time because of this event. So that's why it's garnering a lot of news coverage.
Now, can we expect reciprocal access to the mosque in D.C. where we can have Christian prayers there? Because I've traveled the world. I found myself on the Temple Mount but February of this year, and I'm not allowed to pray as a Christian on the Temple Mount. The Muslims refuse that. They block that. They know the power of Christian prayer. They say, no way, Jose, in Arabic, of course.
Yeah.
Are we able to do that now in D.C. To visit a mosque there?
Yeah, Muslim understanding is that in places where a Muslim call to prayer has taken place, that can be seen as effectively being claimed for Islamic worship in the future. The common illustration people often point back to is in the 600s when Jerusalem was conquered by Muslim Arabs. When the Caliph came into the city, the Patriarch of Jerusalem invited him to come and pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the Patriarch, as history tells it, politely declined, and he said, actually, I can't do that because if I do, my people will see that as taking the place for Islam, and they will turn the church into a mosque, which obviously is not your intent. So there is some degree of precedent of what happens in these places. But in answer to your question, no, I would not expect Christian worship to be invited in and allowed to take place in Washington area mosques. You may have someone come as a speaker to go and give an address, but they are not going to invite Christians in to conduct Christian worship in their mosques, as the cathedral has done to invite Muslim leaders in to do Islamic worship in the National Cathedral. It simply won't happen.
Jeff, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm glad you were able to clear your Friday to watch this unfold on the web stream from the National Cathedral, and we will catch you again soon.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.